So ecosystems. Ecosystems is a bigger scale, and it basically puts ecology all together, namely the biotic and the abiotic environment. And it usually has to do with a system with lots of different organisms and certain characteristics that are caused by the abiotic environment, and that are kind of recognizable as community, as ecosystems, as something that we can actually recognize and say, oh, this is what this is. So let's say an ecosystem in Nova Scotia, this is a marine ecosystem, and Nova Scotia has been overfished. Actually, if you go off of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, you get to the Grand Banks, which at one point was the world's biggest fishery, and mainly for cod. And that went on for hundreds of years, but it wasn't until the rise of factory ships in the 20th century that they basically overfished the whole thing. And unfortunately, it used to be thought that a community would eventually go back to what it was, but it never has. Okay, so a group of communities interacting with one another in a physical environment. In other words, an ecosystem can have all sorts of different communities interacting with it. And we might, let's say, have a community of plants. And then those communities are interacting with the community, let's say, of animals or other consumers or something like that. Okay. So these guys were looking at this fishery. Fisheries have been, kind of mismanaged. It's part of the tragedy of the commons. So when you have a resource, and let's say no one actually owns it, but everybody uses it, you can overuse it and kind of destroy it. And so fishing, overfishing, or any kind of, or overhunting, or anything like that can actually change an ecosystem in a big way, or change everything that's living there. So they noticed as far as the base of the food chain are plankton, and this includes phytoplankton that make their own carbohydrates from photosynthesis, whether it's cyanobacteria or different kinds of algae, or also zooplankton. Zoo is animal, and these are very small planktonic. A lot of them are single-celled, and they go around and they eat the phytoplankton. But above that, you've got all these other kinds of consumers. You've got filter feeding animals like clams and oysters and things like that. You've got animals that move around, whether it's crustaceans like lobsters or crabs, shrimp. You've got all different kinds of fish, some of which are bony fish that we're most familiar with. The other is cartilage fish like sharks and rays. Anyway, this is an ocean ecology, and because of this overfishing, it was kind of decimated, and some of the larger fish, the predators, were taken out, and so all the fish, in fact, were kind of overfished and taken out, and so different things started to happen. Okay, so if we look at how energy moves through an ecosystem. And this is the same thing that goes on with, like, let's say the carbon cycle. So these are nutrients, but the same sort of thing happens. So water moves through an ecosystem. The carbon moves through an ecosystem, taking out from CO2 from the atmosphere or in the water, and turning and using photosynthesis and everything else. And all those things are actually part of the energy system, because carbohydrates are basically taking the sun energy and turning them into usable food. Okay? So you have an energy pyramid, and then you have trophic levels in that pyramid. And a trophic level, when we talked, remember, we talked about producers, consumers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, all that, right? So each of those, the first trophic level is in the ocean environment, it's phytoplankton, okay? And the phytoplankton are the ones that are capturing sunlight and then fixing carbon in the form of carbohydrates. And so the whole ecosystem of the ocean builds on top of that. And then the primary consumer level are these zooplankton that are microscopic, that feed on the phytoplankton, but also there are animals that actually feed on the phytoplankton too. They feed on the zooplankton and the phytoplankton, like filter feeders, clams, oysters, that sort of thing, that filter out either phytoplankton or zooplankton or both, and use those. And there's also fish that actually eat algae and things like that. Okay? And so each of those consumer levels is actually a trophic level. And furthermore, as we can see, most of the energy, well, all of the energy in the whole system is captured from the sun, from photosynthesis, okay? And that's where most of the biomass, in other words, the mass of the matter that makes up all those producers, is. And as energy moves up through a food chain, it loses energy. It loses energy in the form of like heat and cellular respiration, all the things that organisms need to do. They use that energy and they burn it up and they make ATP, they run their cells, they grow, reproduce, all that kind of stuff. And as you go up the food chain, you start losing more and more energy and more biomass. And so you can see you have calories, kilocalories, 10,000, let's say, at the producer level. For the zooplankton, you're losing another 10%, or you're down to 10% of the original, so that's 1,000 kilocalories. If we get to the fish, we're down to 100 kilocalories per 10,000 kilocalories. And then finally, tertiary consumers, or the fourth trophic level, that includes predatory fish that are eating other fish. And there are fewer of those, just like there are fewer predators in an environment like lions compared to the number of animals they eat. So if you remember from the communities, like let's say the community of intertidal zone, where the keystone species was the sea star, that kept all the mussels in check and allowed all the other organisms in that community to live and access the rocks on which to land and live, okay? Or the wolves were a keystone species, predator, and when they were brought back into the system, Yellowstone changed, the plant life changed, kind of recovered. There were much fewer elk. Elk were kept in check, and there were a lot more food for everything else. Okay, so here's phytoplankton, and in this case, because a lot of the fish were fished out, removed from the system, you had all this phytoplankton that was still doing photosynthesis, making carbon, and this phytoplankton bloomed, and it, in fact, it was a big algae bloom, and you could actually see it, and it kind of poisoned the water. So this is something that that I did on fish oil supplements. Most fish oil supplements are all harvested from fish, usually anchovies and herring and menhaden and small fish. And they use these big nets and they take them all out. And when they do that, they kind of destroy this fishery that all depends on it. Those fish eat a bunch of other smaller fish or crustaceans or shrimp or zooplankton or phytoplankton. And then above them, you've got fish like mackerel. That's another trophic level higher. And above that, you've got tuna that eat the mackerel, and so on. And so when you take out all the young anchovies, and all you're doing is you're making this oil, this fish oil, supposedly because it's good for you. And what else they do with it is they make dog food. Okay? So they're basically taking all this fish and doing nothing with it. In fact, these anchovies taste good, but they're not even using it for human food. So the phytoplankton and the zooplankton are the base of the food chain. Secondary consumers such as anchovies feed on the plankton. Tertiary, quaternary, and apex predators compose the rest of the food chain. An apex predator in this would probably be something like a great white shark or something like that. And then, so what happens when the secondary consumers like anchovies and herring are removed from the system to make omega-3 fatty acids, which don't actually do anything for you whatsoever, even though it's a big cell job. So here they are catching all these small fish, and then here's a big sailfish feeding on these other fish that feed on the smaller fish, right? And so this all happened, it's happened in many different places, but also the whole west coast of Peru has been kind of like destroyed. Okay, so energy is lost at each trophic level, as I mentioned before, and it's through metabolic heat, and it's released as a byproduct of all the chemical reactions, including, if you remember, cellular respiration, which breaks down carbohydrates and other things and produces ATP for the cells. In other words, you take glucose, you break it down, you turn it into ATP, and the cells can work. And then the biomass is all the matter that is actually part of all the animals and plants and everything that are there. And so normally what you see is most of the biomass is in the producer level or the primary consumer level, and that's where most of the energy is. And then as you go up, you lose energy at each trophic level, and usually lose a lot of energy. Here it's showing that you lose 90% at each place, but it can vary. So in this, it says only 10% of one trophic level is transferred to the next. The 90% not transferred is not consumed. When we eat an apple, we eat only a small part of the apple tree. Not taken up by the consumer's body. We don't digest the cellulose, and we lose, obviously, metabolic heat to run our metabolism. And so the energy generally flows in one direction. And it goes from producer levels all the way up to the others. Okay, so here's an ecosystem, terrestrial ecosystem. Solar energy provides all the energy that is available to the system. The plants, in this case, and algae are the things that turn solar energy through photosynthesis into carbohydrates, glucose, and all that. And then everything else feeds off of that. And there are all these other nutrients that, let's say, the producers need, phosphorus, nitrogen, various things like that, and of course oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water. And so with the tree, we have a giraffe. It's eating the tree. It's consuming the tree, breaking it down, turning it into ATP, and it's also metabolizing it, and a lot of it is lost to heat. So heat energy is kind of orange, and you can see it's coming off of the polar bears, the giraffes. It's also coming off of all the rabbits. Everything in there is actually losing heat and losing energy throughout the system. And there's all these different trophic levels. And there's apex predator, like in this case, it shows a polar bear, but of course polar bears aren't eating foxes. But you get the idea. There are big apex predators. There's below those other predators. In an African system with zebras and giraffes, the main predators are lions. But lions don't usually eat full-grown giraffes. They eat smaller ones. Okay? So, nutrients, how this thing works. Nutrients in purple neither enter nor leave the cycle. They're just used. And energy is not recycled. It's captured and then transferred among consumers and lost energy. Okay. You can actually watch this little video if you go to chapter on Canvas on chapter 21. So here's our food web again. And then we've got each number is a different trophic level. In other words, 1 are all the producers, the plants. 2 are all the things that eat the plants, whether it is insects or voles or chipmunks or whatever, or pronghorn antelope or bison. They're all eating the vegetation. And then things that eat them, and so on. So we think of nutrients as chemical elements that living things require. We require nitrogen that we can use. We require a bunch of minerals that we need that act as kind of like vitamins and things like that. And then nutrients that we need, like vitamins that we get from other organisms. Okay? And these pass through the abiotic world from rocks, mineral deposits, soil, water, air, and they're taken up by various consumers. And then Earth gets a stream of light energy from the sun that kind of drives everything. There's actually other things that it does too. There are places where there is no sun, and they actually get it from rocks directly. Okay. So here's our nutrient cycle with and beyond the ocean system. And individuals die at each level, from phytoplankton to the top predators. They sink to the bottom. They decompose. They are taken in different levels where they sit there and are further decomposed. Carbon is captured via photosynthesis. Nitrogen, phosphorus, iron, and silicon are absorbed from the water by the phytoplankton as well. Nutrients acquired by zooplankton from phytoplankton are passed up the energy pyramid, and the fish above that get a lot of those nutrients as well, and eventually it's passed up to the top. All these organisms that do cellular respiration are releasing CO2 into the water. No, they're taking they're releasing CO2, right. The producers are taking CO2 out of the water and the atmosphere and turning it into glucose. And then you have all these decomposers that are breaking everything down. Okay. Decomposers return nutrients to the abiotic world by breaking down the bodies of dead organisms, and without that, nutrients will not be repeatedly reused and life would cease. So here we have consumers, decomposers, all losing heat, all losing CO2 or respiring CO2. And then we've got the producers, captured by the producers. They're also releasing, doing cellular respiration and heat loss. Okay. So there's nutrient cycle, the flow of energy, the water cycle that we already went over in chapter 18, succession, the carbon cycle. Succession was in chapter 20. So, in terms of phytoplankton loss, found that 50% loss in the ocean, phytoplankton since 1950. Why? Phytoplankton is the main producer in the ocean. An ocean with less phytoplankton will function differently because ecosystems depend on energy capture. They haven't said why the phytoplankton have declined. Perhaps because all the other consumers aren't broken down and all the nutrients they need aren't getting recycled. And then the phytoplankton, of course, energy capture from photosynthesis in the upper water column. So as ocean temperature increases, chlorophyll decreases. So between 1997 and 2008, satellites, remote sensing, observed that water than average temperature in the ocean were correlated with below average chlorophyll. And so that's why there's less phytoplankton. So net primary productivity is the amount of productivity by the producers that is captured from the sun in photosynthesis over a period of time and area that provides for the growth and reproduction of producers. And then it relies on four things: the amount of energy, water. If you're already in water, there's more than enough. Temperature, usually productivity goes up with greater temperature, and the availability of nutrients. So NPP is net primary productivity, and that's the amount of energy captured directly by photosynthesis. And then the net is actual, the energy captured that is captured and then turned into usable food. And so plants, they have to spend energy as well on cellular respiration, maintenance, growth, and reproduction. So that's what's taken away. And then all the stuff that the plants actually store in their tissues in the form of glucose, or then that is the actual net primary productivity. And usually determine that by measuring the amount of an organism there is from a unit area. So let's say you want to get the biomass for the plants in this area. You collect them, dry them out, and then you burn them, and you actually measure how many calories are in. Okay. So global variation net primary productivity. So in terrestrial ecosystems, that's grams per square meter per year, and we see the greatest productivity are in actual rainforests, in South America, in Africa, and then in Southeast Asia. Okay, that's the greatest part. And then you can see productivity declines the further north or south you go. And then in terms of aquatic ecosystems, again, most of the productivity is along the coasts, in shallower environments, because the sun's rays can only go down so far. And so you can see what the productivity looks like. Okay. Overlaid. And then if you look at elevation and latitude, so altitude and latitude, that means from altitude, from low, let's say sea level, all the way up to high, the highest peaks like Mount Everest. And then if you go from the equator, either north or south, you go in higher latitudes, either towards the North Pole or the South Pole. And then as far as the effects on metabolism and cellular respiration and all that, and production, the lower you are and closer to the equator, usually the more food there is that goes through the system. But you have to remember one thing. If you were to overlay water usage on top of this terrestrial ecosystem, water can limit that from actually happening. So obviously in a tropical rainforest, there's a lot of water. Right here, right? So biomes are large regions of the Earth that have with similar energy capture and net primary productivity. And these biomes are defined by their unique climatic and ecological features. Terrestrial biomes are categorized by temperature, precipitation, and altitude. For example, desert, chaparral, grassland, temperate forest, all that. Aquatic biomes are determined by the proximity to shoreline, wetlands, fresh waters, estuaries, intertidal zones, continental shelf, and then the pelagic zone out in the middle of the ocean. And aquatic biomes, okay. And so rainfall and temperature affect the biome. So this is the water part, and then finally, here we are. So in temperature and water, warm and dry, over on the lower left, we have deserts. If we get a little bit more water in there, then we're going to have grasslands. If we're lower temperature, like higher deserts, there's going to be a cool desert. It's still going to have very little water. Cool grasslands. If we get less temperature, we usually get into coniferous forests like pines, cedars, redwoods, spruce, hemlock, all kinds of different things, larch, And then in terms of temperature, temperate deciduous forests, this corresponds to like North America on the East Coast. Coniferous forests usually either found on more to the west coast of the United States, and then the further north you go, it becomes boreal forest, the taiga, and that's usually very cold, but of course they get sunlight in the summertime. And then in terms of the amount of rainfall, the wetter you get, the more plants you get. Savanna, it's got some trees on it. Temperate deciduous forest, temperate rainforest, like found up in Northern California all the way up into Alaska. And then finally, tropical deciduous forest, tropical rainforest. And then if you go up in this kind of thing where there's a lot of rainfall, you'll get a cloud forest, a tropical cloud forest. So we've looked at this before, biogeographic realms and biomes. We talked about biogeography. So in North America, we have the near Arctic, and there's all kinds of different biomes in them. Everything from temperate grasslands, montane grasslands, there's tundra at the very top, temperate broadleaf forests and in the eastern United States, tropical rainforest, in neotropics, especially in West Africa, the Congo, and Brazil, Venezuela, Colombia, things like that. And so then we've also got the Palearctic, which is all through Europe and Asia, all the way to East Asia, and then Afrotropic, which is in Africa. These all correspond to kind of continental areas. Australia, and then Indo-Malaysia, that whole area, Southeast Asia, the neotropics, and then Oceania are all these islands that have different kinds of life on them that all got there from dispersal. And at one point, there was a lot of life in Antarctica before it actually ended up. So you can go through these yourself. Tundra is found in the Arctic, at the poles, actually, both. And also, you can find this in mountaintops, very high mountaintops. So if you go to the Sierras and you go above 10,000 feet, you'll see these kind of grass alpine regions that are very much like tundra. Okay? It's cold up there, and so there's usually a short growing season. Snow usually stays on the ground for a long time. If you were to go to Chaparral, this is the kind of so Chaparral, this is called Mediterranean, and it's this kind of stuff that you find in Mediterranean, along the Mediterranean, or also in California or South Africa. And usually they get all their rain from about the fall through the winter and the early spring, and then it doesn't rain after that or much precipitation for 6 months. Let's see. Boreal forest, completely, it's mainly conifers, like I showed here, lodgepole pine, larch, and all kinds of different things. The soil is thin. There's usually large herbivores living in this area. You can read that yourself. Freshwater biomes, lakes, estuaries, that sort of stuff. Landlocked bodies of water, and then a tropical forest, which has a closed canopy, dense numbers of trees, high species species diversity aim. Usually lower relative abundance for each species, right? Here you have high relative abundance of a few species. Temperate forest, that kind of thing you find in eastern North America. Estuaries, deserts where water is limited, marine environments, all different kinds, from close to the coast all the way out into the middle of the ocean, and grasslands of various types. And then I've added this here. See kind of what a tundra looks like in Alaska. If you look at a temperature, you can see that, let's say, up in Alaska, January and December are the coldest months. February barely not really. It's starting to warm up probably around March. Cold again. Let's see, average temperature. Very low average temperature and very high variation. So low average but high variation. And then annually, annual very low and low variation. Okay, so it's usually cold. Much colder in general. And so you can see the average. Oh, this is precipitation. So usually up in the tundra, you don't get very much precipitation. So here we go. So purple is precipitation, temperature. You can see how they vary. Okay. Now, if I were to ask you, if I gave you something like these curves, and I gave you something like this, or let's say from another biome that would look different, I'd ask you, what does this look like? You would have to pick, so, right one. Okay, so boreal forest, northern Canada, definitely cold subarctic lands. There's a lot of trees, unlike the tundra. Low species diversity, but high numbers to a certain extent. Average temperature is low, so it's cold, and the variation is very high. If in the summertime, it can be pretty warm. And then precipitation, kind of low, variation is low, but more variation than in the tundra. And finally, temperate forest. Okay, so much greater temperatures, moderate temperatures, moderate variation. In the wintertime, it's going to be around 0 sometimes, not very often, usually in the 20s and 30s. And then in the summertime, it can get pretty warm. And most of the rain, there's rain total all during the year. In, let's see, in January, February, March, snow, and December, and then it turns to rain. And then the summertime rains. So about the same as a deciduous forest. Okay. Temperate grasslands, you can see again, higher annual temperature, actually a little bit hotter sometimes. And then finally, this is degrees Celsius, by the way, and then you can actually see how they get in terms of precipitation. Okay, and then here's a desert, of course, very high average temperature, moderate variation. Deserts can actually get pretty cold depending on how high altitude. Very low precipitation period. Variation low, but sometimes you get years where you get a lot, like this year, there was a lot of moisture, precipitation in the deserts, the Mojave, the Sonoran, and we had a great bloom, and the deserts actually got pretty green. Anthropomorphic biomes, humans directly affecting. So if you go to a city like this, is this what, Chicago or something? I don't know. Anyway, they can be pretty, pretty warm. Like Atlanta, if you go to Atlanta, Atlanta is much warmer than the vegetation areas of rural vegetation. But anyway, you can see kind of what you get. Cities and suburbs get anthropogenic biomes. And then finally, tropical wet forests, very high annual temperature, low variation. It's usually just pretty much warm all the time, even when it's raining. Lots and lots of water and high variation. There's usually a rainy season and a dry season, unlike in the north, or temperate regions where you have differences in temperature, lower temperatures in the wintertime, higher temperatures in the summertime. So this is usually high temperatures all the time, but what varies instead of temperature is rainfall. And then there's also something called, as I mentioned, there's tropical dry forests that aren't quite as wet as this, less rainfall, but they also have a wet and dry season as well. And then cloud forests that usually fairly cold, but tropical and lots and lots and lots of precipitation, as much as you see in the lowland tropical forests. And that's it.